I, Anushmi Jain, Faculty of Law, on behalf of the ICFI University Dehradun, ICFI Law School, would like to welcome you all to the international webinar on right to liberty and duty to the community during COVID-19 pandemic. For today's session, we have with us former Chief Justice, Supreme Court of Sri Lanka, retired Attorney General, Honorable Mr. Justice Mohan Pieris, President's Counsel. Moving towards today's session, it is requested to all the participants to fill the feedback form, which shall be circulated both on Zoom chat box as well as YouTube comment section during the session to mark your presence. Now, I would like to call upon Professor Dr. Yugal Kishore, Dean, ICFI Law School, to give welcome address. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam Anushmi Jain.
Thank you, sir.
Most respected, Honorable Mr. Justice Mohan Pieris ji, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Registrar, academicians from different parts of the country and my university, law professionals, student friends from Pan India. Today is a historical day for us that we have a very, very learned and enlightened person, the former Chief Justice of Sri Lanka, Mr. Justice Honorable Mohan Pieris ji. He will be discussing about on this international webinar the right to liberty and duty to community during COVID-19 period. So at this occasion, I welcome one and all to you. I will be speaking initially something about this ICFI University, just to introduce you. So the ICFI University was established in the year 2003 by a legislature of the state of Uttarakhand with the support of a great educationist and education institution builder, Mr. N.J. Yashaswi, who had in fact established 11 universities, which has law schools in 7 universities and tech school in 7 universities, business school in 9 universities. So he was instrumental in establishing this particular university. And right from the time when this university was established, this university has tried to inculcate the values and ethics in the student to work for the society and provided standard education with research orientation. And with the result that this year, in the year 2020, this university has been ranked 44 by the URI ranking, that is called World University for Real Impact by United Nations Training Institute, and it has been ranked first by many other surveys. Simultaneously, the ICFI Law School also started in the year 2004, and this ICFI Law School, right from the beginning until today, has been providing standard legal education, and which is having a professional bent in its curriculum and side by side research orientation. So with this, today we have been designated as ranked as the first best university in Uttarakhand, where along with the 6th top universities with a super excellence by CSR survey. Even the India Today survey has also ranked us 26 among all the NLUs, which are 25 in number at today, and the central universities, state universities, and private universities. So this way, we have provided our quality education in this university with professional skills. Now this university has also been awarded with E-Lead certificate for its proficiency in online learning and education pattern. Now, today we have got an international webinar on right to liberty and duty to community during COVID-19 pandemic. You know, this COVID-19 has made us under lockdown for around 2 months, and therefore our right to liberty was curtailed. And many persons started saying that this was not very proper at that time. But then simultaneously, we do have a duty towards community to see that human rights of everyone in the community is protected. Not only my right of liberty is protected. So there has got to be a proper balance. We have got a very enlightened, learned, and distinguished jurist, Professor Mohan Pieris, who will be talking about this particular topic. Now, I will be requesting my academic coordinator of the ICFI Law University, Madam Monica Kharola, to please give a brief introduction of our Professor Honorable Mr. Justice Mohan Pieris.
Madam Monica Kharola.
Thank you so much, sir. Honorable Mohan Pieris has been appointed as a 44th Chief Justice of Sri Lanka on 15th January 2013. His lordship was the Attorney General of Sri Lanka from 2008 to 2011 and became the senior legal advisor to the Cabinet of Ministers in 2011. Justice Pieris was educated at St. Joseph College, Colombo and Royal College, Colombo. He became chairman of Sale Bank in April 2012. Justice Mohan was admitted as an attorney at law to the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka in 1975 and as Solicitor of Supreme Court of England and Wales in 1978. In 1981, he joined the Attorney General's Department as a State Counsel and retired as Senior State Counsel in 1996. He practiced for a period of 15 years in civil, public law, and arbitration. During this time, he trained at the National Institute of Trial Advocacy at Harvard Law School, the Center for Police and Criminal Justice Studies at Jesus College, Cambridge, and at George Washington University. He has been a several Sri Lankan delegation to the international forums, the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations Environmental Programme, South Asian Agency for Regional Cooperation in Law, and Tariff Negotiation in European Commission. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, we feel pleasure that you joined us. Thank you so much. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. May I first of all thank the ICFI Law School in Dehradun, its dean, my close and good friend, Professor Kisho, and Professor Ekta Galawat, the Vice Chancellor, the Registrar, and all those who have been engaged in organizing this perhaps very important webinar. My dear friends, we are presently experiencing exceptionally difficult times during which mankind has been made to look so insignificant by Mother Nature, isn't it? Many a philosophy has been propounded in the last perhaps 5 months in search for an answer to the true meaning of life at a time in history when mankind was considered having mastery over his environment or perhaps even the planet, or to be more accurate, even beyond the planetary system. When we considered ourselves virtually playing the role of God himself, but to be sooner than later made to realize that we are microscopic, we are helpless beings in a planet, I don't know whether you realized it, that hovers around one of the lesser stars. That is the supreme irony of today's creation. My dear friends, Benjamin Franklin, the founding father of the United States, a leading writer, political philosopher, politician, and scientist, had this to say, quote, he said, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. I'll say it again. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty or safety. Now, this observation, you will see, begs the question as to what Franklin was hoping to substantially secure. I'm sure he was substantially seeking to secure an environment of social safety in terms of the social contract that each one of us have entered into to stop this deadly virus that has killed more than 500,000 people on the planet as at now. My dear friends, you will agree that Franklin's observation faces a serious challenge from the coronavirus. Many countries have adopted serious measures never ever experienced before. We have seen an incremental increase of these measures as the pandemic spreads. Several countries have imposed nationwide lockdowns. Interestingly, many academics have gone on to observe that these extreme measures should be immune from judicial review, from the scope of review of our courts, although many jurisdictions have put in place almost draconian measures. Am I not right? Dear friends, in this part of the world that we live in, surely, we think twice when we are asked to trade liberty for security. It is therefore necessary that we should take a step back to think about the legal constraints concerning the lockdown measures in our countries. The question is, could the courts be excluded from the oversight of such extreme emergency measures? My dear friends, constitutional law provides substantial guidance for understanding the government's authority for responding to the pandemic. You will appreciate that a lockdown in whatever form is a species of preventive detention. Quote, it is a restriction of physical liberty imposed otherwise outside the criminal process. Did you realize that? So it is well settled law, as propounded by our superior courts of many of our jurisdictions, that in our society, liberty is the norm and detention outside the criminal process is a carefully limited exception. You will appreciate that there are several forms of preventive detention which our constitutional systems have recognized. One such simple example is the case of a person who has a serious psychiatric disorder and presents a danger to himself and to others. Now, there are three fundamental questions that need to be addressed in considering preventive detention. The first, my dear students, is whether the state has lawful authority to adopt preventive detention measures outside the criminal process. Secondly, whether the state in the exercise of that power has been reasonable in the exercise of that authority vis-a-vis the achieving of that objective. In other words, has the exercise of power been proportionate in addressing the harm that is sought to be avoided? And finally, as to whether the state has followed a well thought out procedure for the exercise of that power in the context of the particular group or the community at large. My students, you will appreciate that without dimmer, so to speak, without a doubt, that state authorities have the authority to resort to measures of preventive detention to protect public health. Now, although one might be tempted to argue that no government should have the power to subject people to a lockdown when they have done nothing wrong, this very fact alone strengthens the argument for preventive detention, as in the case perhaps of a psychiatric patient, because the source of the danger we face here is not the result of any voluntary conduct. You will therefore appreciate that the criminal justice system has very limited authority to address the threat to public safety in the wake of the pandemic. My dear students, public health experts are of the firm view that the community would risk their health themselves and their neighbors by their failure to comply with the conditions of a lockdown. And in those circumstances, I can assure you, the judicial system would surely support that view, as I believe they should. Dear friends, I'm asking you the question, did we need a pandemic to beg the question as to the importance of the right to personal liberty and our duties towards the community? What a shame if it did. That it was a pandemic that woke us up to the realities in life. It was the pandemic that begged that question. To ask the question as to whether we are enjoying our liberties the way we ought to. Isn't it the case that we have consigned the issue of liberty to the back burner because our own personal liberty has hitherto not been impacted upon because it happens to someone else? It doesn't happen to us. So long as it's happened to someone else, it really didn't bother us, isn't it? My dear students, aren't we asking that question as a result of our utter hopelessness in the face of the real threat to our very existence? Shouldn't we then have been asking that question much earlier? Is it something that we paid scant regard to? Did it ever occur to us to question ourselves? What have we been doing with ourselves? We're talking of rights all the time. Rights and rights. The duties we hardly think of. I will leave you to find the answers to those questions. And I'm fairly sure that you will end up saying, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. That's in Latin. What it means is through my fault, through my most grievous fault. So much so that in some parts of the developed world, people are willing to go on their knees, as we saw a few months ago, on the streets of Rome, praying for pardon from their Creator, whom they hitherto did not even know. That is the pathetic irony that humankind has been placed in today on this beautiful planet of ours. My dear students, a Spanish writer, Catherine Sikink, read her if you can, in her new book, The Hidden Face of Rights Towards the Politics of Responsibility, makes the observation that for a comprehensive implementation of human rights, there is a need to place greater emphasis on the obligations cast on all stakeholders, not just governments, with a view that we take action together so as to make sure that rights are enjoyed in its full amplitude by each one of us. The writer says that even if all governments were taking efficient action and individuals also do their share by staying at home and taking all the precautionary measures, the corona crisis can be averted, or perhaps would not be averted. She goes on to argue that all stakeholders socially connected to the injustices in the structure and have the capacity to do something about it need to take action to address that injustice. It appears that one of the issues of the word, she says, responsibility, is that people often use it in the context of who is to blame or who is liable. The moment we talk of responsibility, we immediately talk of who is to blame or who is liable. And that's what Sikking says. Quite true, isn't it? Another scholar is Iris Young. Iris Young describes it as, perhaps she calls it, a liability model. I thought the words were marvelous. A liability model. Iris Young has set her sights on a forward-looking political responsibility. A political responsibility that is futuristic, that doesn't ask the question, who is to blame? But what we should do, and goes on to suggest that it is this forward-looking responsibility that is required to address the pandemic, to enable us to plan as to what we should do on this planet post-pandemic. My dear students, you will agree that this might be a framework which might be beneficial in the current context because it connects up with a range of rights, a range of responsibilities of a wide canvas of stakeholders. Think about it. Our right to liberty, the freedom of movement, to education, to information, to food and shelter, and to health. All these things come into focus as they have a potential power to rain havoc with all our activities, isn't it? If we look around us, we will see many countries adapting very strict border foreign policies, such as Sri Lanka, such as India, to keep people out, such as the United States. Most of our rights to movement are compromised. But whether we like it or not, governments need to strike a balance in the protection of all those rights, particularly the protection of our right to good health and the protection of human rights. You will recall that the Secretary General of the WHO on the 12th of March of this year was pleased to observe that quarantine is a legitimate state policy in terms of health emergencies, but the state must attend to the rights of individuals caught in the quarantine to adequate healthcare, food, and shelter. Dear friends, if we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will see that the Declaration speaks of a limitation of rights. Why? For the purposes to ensure the respect for rights and freedoms of others. The Universal Declaration goes even further and decrees that each one of us has a duty to the community, whilst there is a loud call to all of us to promote human rights in the very preamble of the Declaration. You will agree that a draftsman brought out that strong message that if the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was to fully blossom, it has to be by a joint, collective effort by all stakeholders. So therefore, you will therefore observe, as the academics put it, that in order for all citizens on the planet to enjoy these rights, everyone who is connected socially to the problem, who have the capacity to take some action, must activate themselves and take action to practice those duties, the definition of which may not always be clearly known. My dear students, take for example our right to health. How do we protect our right to health? Now, in order that we protect our right to health, we surely must recognize that we have a right to the freedom of movement, while simultaneously we have an obligation not to travel in certain circumstances, because the very act of traveling compromises our health, such as in the current context. Think about it. Let's talk about it. Let's take another example, the right to education. You will agree that the right to education, that we might have to well accept the position that it can be suspended temporarily, like what we are doing with our schools and our universities today, or delivered, as I frequently do these days, by resorting to information technology. So one must therefore concede that the WHO has been taking some very proactive steps in the last few weeks. Just a few minutes ago, I did make the observation that in order for all stakeholders to enjoy these rights, that everyone connected socially to the pandemic must practice that these obligations although these obligations are not well defined. My dear friends, the performance of different countries is varied with regard to the responses to the pandemic. While some of them are faring badly, some of them are faring well, and yet some of them moderately. You will appreciate the responsibility that society has to bear does not end with national governments. You will agree that they percolate to state governments. You will agree that they percolate to local bodies, health institutions, the media, the non-governmental organizations, the universities and schools, and all the way down to each and every one of us. Our responsibilities in the context of COVID-19 at a very simple level, has been the washing of hands, to wear a face mask, staying in at home, and to be well educated with regard to what the pandemic means, and not to be guided by misinformation. Now, what is important about this? Pause for a moment to ask yourself the question, how the simple washing of hands with soap and water has developed into a new norm and has become a global governance issue. Although I have to sound cynical and remind ourselves that we do wash our hands off on many issues, shunning thereby from the responsibility as Pontius Pilate did on that very infamous Good Friday when he condemned the Christ himself. You will therefore agree that individual duties and obligations would include inaction, such as not hoarding essential merchandise, not buying masks that you don't need. So therefore, it is therefore observed that individuals don't go about observing their social responsibilities on their own, but together with institutions and social connections with others, even in practicing the social distance necessary to limit the transmission of COVID-19. My dear friends, the academics seem to suggest in the context of the travel bans that a futuristic policy on rights and obligations undoubtedly needs greater coordinated national and international response, that it requires more or better global governance for solving the pandemic and the inevitable economic crisis that it will give rise to. My dear students, you will agree that the biggest challenge, therefore, that we have today is to find an answer as to how we can use this crisis as a stepping stone to a new future for global governance, rather than wash our hands off from the problem. I must concede that this discussion begs an answer to the question as to what extent can a government lawfully restrict the liberties of its citizens in order to serve the common good of the nation. Some of you might ask yourselves the question as to what extent has the protection of the public welfare be compromised for governments to take measures to curtail some of our rights. I can assure you that this is not a novel situation, unknown to mankind. And this tension between the need to protect the community and our fundamental rights over the aspect of public health and the acceptance of its measures was seen during the policies to combat infectious diseases, as you know, historically in the 19th and 20th centuries. This has been an enduring tension, my dear students, between public health and individual rights, which we have swept under the carpet at our own peril, so to speak. Now, interestingly, the judicial pronouncements on this matter, if I was to summarize it in a few words, has been that the courts, more through an abundance of caution and fear, I think, we judges, in many jurisdictions, have come down in favor of the protection of public health in preference to individual rights and liberties. It has been seen that through most of the 20th century, the wide powers that public health authorities had enjoyed remained almost unchallenged. But during the last decade of the old millennium, you will recall there appears to have been a shift of attitude due to the vigorous development of jurisprudence on privacy and the revolution on due process, which visited the aspects of the rights to prisoners, mental patients, and others under the power of the state. I might mention, for reasons of completing the picture, I might mention it in passing that it was the HIV/AIDS epidemic that virtually forced a complete rethinking of the dominant ideology of public health. You will recall that the HIV/AIDS epidemic set the stage to canvass and to speak about a new paradigm of public health. And I do submit most respectfully that there are lessons to be learned from that approach to the paradigm to be adopted in our approach to the rights and duties in the context of COVID-19. My dear students, the proponents and defenders of civil liberties were able to tell us that there was no tension that existed between public health and civil liberties, and that on the contrary, they were able to say that policies that protected civil liberties would support the policies of public health, and that any policy that was prejudicial to rights would subvert public health. They are not clashing, they are in harmony. You will therefore appreciate that policy, that the kind of policy which was true for HIV/AIDS is also true for public health in a general sense. Dear students, a question has also been asked as to how true it was to say that there is no tension between public health and civil liberties. Many people have asked me that. It must be appreciated that public health surveillance, for example, for epidemics and pandemics is crucial in order to understand the pattern of the disease and the planning and the execution of action to remedy the disease. These questions cannot be answered without confronting, surely, the tensions between the interests of individuals and those of the community. If one takes a peek back at SARS, you've heard of SARS, SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, which is the precursor to this pandemic. We would easily see how difficult it is to make the decisions between conflicting rights in the face of uncertainty. If we look back in retrospect, one might say that quarantines imposed in the face of a potential epidemic were more expensive than necessary. We can probably say that. But we do not know that in the face of an evolving threat to public health officials had no choice but to weigh personal liberty against potentially serious threat. The legal literature on the subject seems to clearly suggest that public health measured collectively in terms of the lives of individuals and on a population basis requires intervention that involves restrictions of choice. On the 11th of March, the WHO, which declared the outbreak of COVID, had reached the level of a global pandemic and called for governments to take urgent and aggressive steps to stop the spread of the virus, as you know. You will appreciate that international human rights law provides a guarantee to persons to the highest attainable standards of health and medical care. Human rights law also recognizes the fact that there is a serious public health threat and public emergency that threatens the life of the nation, and there is a justification for the restriction of those rights. Restrictions, my dear students, that are strictly necessary having regard to scientific evidence, restrictions which are not arbitrary, restrictions which are not discriminatory, restrictions which are limited in duration, respectful of human dignity, restrictions that are subject to review and commensurate with the doctrine of proportionality is what we require. You will agree that the scale of severity of the pandemic undoubtedly gives rise to a threat to public health, and that health would inevitably justify restrictions of certain rights. And that is why we have the imposition of a quarantine, limiting the freedom of movement. Now, I must perhaps strike a note of warning that simultaneously we must ensure that we practice human rights in a manner that is non-discriminatory, transparently, and with respect for human dignity. And that can come from the imposition by perhaps not imposing unnecessarily brought in measures that compromise our rights. My dear students, give me a moment to refer briefly to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the ICCPR. The ICCPR decrees that everyone has the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Governments, therefore, are obliged to take effective steps for the prevention, treatment, and the control of epidemics and pandemics. The United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is the monitoring body for state compliance with the covenant, has made the observation, quote, you might make a note of this, that the right to health is closely related to and dependent upon the realization of other human rights as contained in the International Bill of Rights, including the right to food, the right to housing, the right to work, education, human dignity, life, the right to life itself, and the freedom against discrimination and equality above all. The right to health, therefore, provides that the health facilities must be available, accessible, acceptable, and medically appropriate. We are also reminded of the Siracusa principle, S-I-R-A-C-U-S-A, the Siracusa principle, adopted by the United Nations Economic and Social Council in 1984. This principle, the Siracusa principle, provides authoritative guidance on governments' responses that restrict human rights for reasons of public health or national emergency. The principle says that the restrictions must be lawful, necessary, and proportionate. On the 16th of March, 2020, a group of human rights experts, whilst appreciating the measures taken by governments as a response to curtailing the pandemic, also hastened to issue a note of warning that the pandemic should not be used as a basis to target particular groups, minorities, or individuals. Salutary warning, my dear students. You may note that the Siracusa principle specifically states that the restrictions imposed should be at a minimum. In other words, the least restrictive burden must be placed on people. That the restrictions should be lawful. It must be of general interest. It must be to achieve the objective, and it must be at least least intrusive, as I said, or restrictive. And it must be based on scientific evidence and of limited duration. Can I say it in no uncertain terms? It cannot be and should never be arbitrary. My dear students, you will also bear in mind that under international human rights law, governments have a duty to protect the rights to freedom of expression, the right to seek, to receive and impart information regardless of national boundaries. It must, however, be noted that permissible restrictions on the freedom of expression for reasons of public health may not necessarily compromise the right itself. Keep that in mind. As we have experienced, all information about COVID-19 must be accessible and available in multiple languages, which would include perhaps sign language too. One would agree, you would agree with me that if the infrastructure supports such a facility, unfettered access to the internet should be maintained and steps be taken to ensure that internet access to people with, particularly to people with low income. Dear students, it is important to remember, or perhaps a very important thing to remember, is that the authorities should avoid sweeping and unnecessarily broad restrictions on movement and personal liberty, and only adopt measures of mandatory restrictions when scientifically warranted, and when mechanisms for support of those affected can be ensured, guaranteed. So you will see, it will be accepted, you will all agree with me, and you will accept it without dimmer, that voluntary self-isolation combined with education, widespread screening, and access to treatment are more likely to induce the cooperation of the public and protect public trust than coercive measures, and will certainly be likely to prevent attempts to avoid contact with the healthcare system. We all know that COVID-19, like other infectious diseases, poses a very high danger to populations that live in close proximity to each other. The authorities in those situations, such as places of detention, such as prisons, jails, immigration detention centers, residential institutions for people with disabilities, and nursing homes for the elderly, must take great care in balancing the need for protection within the framework of human rights. Dear friends, I think I have left you with sufficient material to ponder upon this great debate of how we should balance personal liberty as against our duty to the community in the context of a globally novel virus that keeps us confined to our homes already for the last almost 5 months, and hopefully not for a few more months. Is already reorienting our relationship to government. It's reorienting our relationships to the outside world, and even perhaps to each other. Isn't that so? Think about it. Now, this reorientation that is foreseen in the times to come might feel unfamiliar. It certainly was unsettling for myself. The question that will haunt us will be, will nations stay closed? Will touching each other as human beings be something strange? What would happen to my favorite restaurant? Where is the human being in me and my neighbor? These are questions that will haunt us. But remember that moments of crisis such as this also lends itself, as I said before, itself to opportunity. Remember that the more sophisticated and flexible use of technology, reduced incidence of polarization, revived an appreciation for the environment and other simple pleasures of life. Hasn't it been? Look at the number of messages that are flying across the world of the nice things that are happening in the world. It has given us greater time for leisure. Is that not the case? Which no doubt we would soon be intolerant of being human. I'm afraid I cannot prophesize exactly what will come. But here is a forecast of a prophecy that one academic put it, that has a serious impact on the dream, I say, of our personal liberty, the dream of our personal liberty. He says the comfort of being in the presence of others might be replaced with a greater comfort of absence, especially with those we don't know intimately. He says, instead of asking the question, is there a reason to do this online, as I'm doing now? You'll be asking the question, is there any good reason to do this in person at all? Tempting, isn't it? The online contact will create more distance, while no doubt it will give you more connections. I'm told that today we have over 500 connected to us as we discuss this. As we communicate more often with people who are physically far away and who feel safer to us because of that distance, we have no problem in talking to them because they're thousands of miles away. My question to you, my dear students, who then is your community? Who then, in that context, is your neighbor? That's one issue that will haunt us. The next thing he says You will see, he says, a kind of new patriotism. Oh, we are full of patriotism, aren't we? Too much of it, perhaps. He says, when you will start to understand patriotism more as cultivating the health and life of your community rather than blowing up someone else's community. That's the kind of patriotism that we will soon be following. It is just possible that the need for demilitarization and the love of the community will be one of the benefits to come out of this major debacle. They say that there will be a decline in polarization. It is said in the context that given our current level of tension at every level of society, the pandemic scenario suggests that the time is ripe to begin to promote constructive patterns in our cultural and political discourse. The writer says that there will come a serious attitude in our people that expertise matters, that it was easy to reject and ignore environmental and medical experts until the pandemic hit us. There will be less time for individualism, as one academic puts it. This pandemic, he says, marks the end of our romance with market society and hyper-individualism. She says we will reorient our political ethos and make substantial investment in public good, for public health, and for public services. We will become less communal because we are beginning to realize that we are all brothers and sisters of one human family. We will be better able to see how our faiths are linked irrespective of our ethnic divisions, our religious divergence, and our cultural differences. The coronavirus, my dear students, is going to cause immense pain. It has caused already immense pain and suffering. But from a human rights point of view, we will be forced to reconsider who we are and what we value in the long term. And in the long term, it will help us to rediscover the better version of ourselves. We will begin to see ourselves in the other, and the other will begin to see himself in us, the real human being in us. The magic, I call it the magic of creation. Religious worship, another academic says, will look different. And Amy Sullivan, the academic, says, all faiths have faced the challenges of keeping the faith alive under difficult conditions. Religion never found it so difficult until the pandemic hit it. The pandemic really, people stopped worrying about religion. But never have we had a situation where these efforts were at the same time. There were efforts made to follow religion at the same time, irrespective of what faith you follow. We are all, you will see the irony and perhaps the joke of it, that we are all now in constant prayer, pleading to the Creator to rid us of this terrible menace of the pandemic. The planet, if this was the case, you will agree that the planet must surely now be a heaven on earth. The times of quarantine challenges, the conceptions of what it means to minister and fellowship. Contemplative practices may gain popularity. We will begin to realize our interconnected humanity. Do we really now worry too much to our right to personal liberty? Do we? Seriously? The answer is no. COVID-19 will sweep away many of the artificial barriers for moving more of our lives online. And that's something that we can see profoundly. We will be asking the question, what can I authentically offer? I have a life, I have a history. What do people need? If moving forward, we apply our human instincts to our devices, that will be a powerful COVID-19 legacy, isn't it, my dear students? As someone said, not only alone together, but together alone. The list appears to be unending. There are many lessons to be learned, and it is my final wish that we will be rid of this terrible menace of COVID-19, and that we would soon find the right blend and balance between our personal liberties and the duty towards our community. My dear students, the final prognosis, to put it beyond doubt, is that public health measures collectively in terms of the lives of individuals and a population basis requires the imposition of restrictions on our liberty. Let's be honest. There is a painful restriction of our liberty that we have experienced, but wouldn't a little bit of pain right now be worth it for each one of us and for the community that we live in? The most important thing in this coronavirus response is perhaps to keep our head along with our rights, not to be disproportionate, not to be draconian, but to gain public trust that a voluntary restriction of our liberty would be well worth it, having regard to the ultimate objective of keeping our planet a safe place in which we can practice and put in action human rights at its best. I thank you for giving me a patient hearing, and I wish you all good luck and best wishes in your academic pursuits. Thank you. I would be happy to take any questions you would want me to answer if I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the informative session. Sir, myself, Vishal Bira, Faculty Associate, sir, would be now moderating the question answer session for you. So
Sure.
Should we begin, sir?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So the first question to you is, how emerging human rights challenges inequality, discrimination, and exclusion?
Emerging human rights, how it?
How emerging human rights challenges inequality, discrimination, and exclusion.
Right. Inequality, discrimination,
And exclusion.
Yeah. Now, you will see that really this is nothing new. You will see that we have been talking of, we were born free, we are born equal, we have natural rights, don't we? Right. And those natural rights that we have always had, we have never lost by virtue of the social contract that we have engaged with the state. We have translated those to a new set of rights that will be exercised, that will be practiced globally, right? Now, human rights, as you will see, has been put in place. We have, in other words, irrespective of the cultural diversity. In other words, we are trying to strive and achieve a position where we cannot have our own style and our own style of human rights. We can't have one set of human rights for India, or perhaps one set of human rights for Chennai, and another set of human rights for Gujarat, and another set of in Uttarakhand, right? Or in Assam, or perhaps in Mumbai, right? There cannot be, in other words, it can't be culturally modified. It can't be modified on religious lines. It can't be modified on ethnic lines. So that is perhaps that is what we are trying to strive to achieve. So that a universal set of human rights, a universal regime would strive to achieve that equality. After all, remember, equality is the cornerstone of human rights. Perhaps the first rule is one of equality. All other rights kind of revolve around it, isn't it? Right? So the exclusion, the exclusion, inequality, discrimination. Now remember, can I say a word about discrimination? Remember, there is no rule against discrimination. Discrimination is certainly possible so long as there is an intelligible rationale for the differentia. An intelligible rationale for the differentia. So there you are. Everything that per se on the face of it looks discriminatory may not necessarily be violative of human rights. No. But of course, there are some human rights which are, that forms part of the jus cogens, the peremptory norms. For example, the right against torture, the right to profess your own religion, right? The right of the freedom of speech, right? So those are peremptory norms. That's part of our basic structure, isn't it? Right? So there you are. You can discriminate, right? Human rights permits discrimination so long as there is an intelligible rationale for the differential. In other words, there must be an intelligent reason why you should make the difference in promulgating human rights. Then if you talk of exclusion, if you are talking of the exclusion of human rights, I can straight away tell you, the only exception to the exclusion of human rights is where derogation from human rights is permissible, within permissible parameters. Now, for example, let's take international humanitarian law, the laws of war. Now, that's a classic derogation, but we can talk about this for the whole day, perhaps. So there you are. There are permissible derogations where you can probably not exclude, but move away to meet a particular limited contingency during a particular time. And you know that you have to inform the United Nations if you are derogating from human rights for a particular purpose, right? And then once that purpose is achieved, you have to get back from that purpose very quickly. And that also with the concurrence of the United Nations. So the question of inequality, discrimination, and exclusion has to be viewed within those parameters, if that simple answer actually answers that question. Right.
Thank you so much, sir. So the next question to you is relating to some examples. That is, sir, please refer to some examples of good practice where responses are being shaped by human rights.
Some good practice of responses are being shaped by human rights.
Yes, sir.
Right. Now, perhaps a very good practice is shaped by human rights. Now, take your own look at your Constituent Assembly. Look at your own Constituent Assembly. Right? When they drafted that constitution, they gave special care to human rights, isn't it? Why? You're the makers of Dr. Ambedkar and his team of draftsmen and perhaps those great statesmen, right? They took special care to build human rights into it, isn't it? Take our own constitution in Sri Lanka. The human rights discourse has driven successive governments to give human rights a special place in its constitution and make it justiciable. We have human rights commissions. In other words, today human conduct is measured by the compliance of the global standards of human rights, isn't it? It's not the Indian standard of human rights. It's not the Sri Lankan standard of human rights. In other words, human rights, if you look around us today, human rights is enjoying perhaps a cornerstone of our lives. It's virtually part of our genetic character, isn't it? So there you are. I cannot think of any activity in which that can be devoid of human rights, for the reason that human rights is part of, perhaps I would go so far as to say that it is part of the design of our Creator.
Thank you so much, sir. So should we take 2 more questions?
Of course.
Yes, sure. Sir. So why justice, restraint, and respect for the rule of law are essential to the COVID-19 response?
Justice,
restraint, and respect for the rule of law are essential to the COVID-19 response.
I think we might have to do another lecture to answer that question, but we can endeavor to try and answer that. Look at this. What does the rule of law do for you? The rule of law simply limits governmental activity and presents to us a paradigm by which we can live in dignity, right? Now, justice also must be tempered, right? we were talking of restraint. Now, surely we all have to be restrained. In other words, tolerance. Look at what happened. Now look at it this way. We were all confined in our homes for 2-3 months. We did it, although not very happily, but we did it with some kind of voluntariness, isn't it? Because we knew that our very existence was threatened. Our very existence was threatened. So there you are. We have to restrain our freedom of speech. We must be careful when we talk of COVID-19, not to cause chaos in the minds of people, not to spread disinformation. We must be careful not to take on unnecessary journeys, because you might not know, you may be infected, or you might actually catch the infection. You might bring it home, right? So there you are. So freedom of speech, the freedom of the liberty of freedom of movement, the freedom of probably expression, the freedom of association have to be limited for a little while. In other words, no amount of human rights cannot survive in an indisciplined environment. Human rights can only perhaps thrive in a democracy, isn't it? So there you are. We need self-restraint. After all, we are the only ones on the planet who have been given a faculty that helps us to think. We are the only beings who have a faculty that enables us to think and decide for ourselves. Aren't we special? Are we just going to give it up merely because can we have unbridled human rights that will destroy us? No. We have to use our faculties, our mind, in order to discipline ourselves so that human rights in turn can itself and justice in turn can survive. What kind of justice can there be if there is mayhem, the absence of human rights, the absence of tolerance, right? The absence of violence, in the absence of if there was violence in the community. So there you are. We have to act with restraint, and that's why we have been given that's why we are human, that we are different from other beings. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. And the last question for the day to you is, how social responsibility is overruled to right to liberty?
So can you repeat yourself again, please?
How social responsibility is overruled to right to liberty?
Right. Now, to answer this question, answer that question with a little example. We all agree that we have the freedom of speech. Isn't that right? We have the freedom of speech. Now, you have every right to say anything you want, but I may not agree with you. In other words, I must be able to respect your freedom of speech, although I do not probably agree with what you say, if I take the example of the freedom of speech. But remember that although you have a right to say what you want, the community expects you to say it with responsibility. And every one of those human rights, the right to liberty, for example, you have the freedom to go anywhere you will, but you shan't walk on the railway track. You shan't be driving at speeds which are well above the limits of safety. You can't be biking around like a maniac, can you? Right. So the freedom of the liberty, your freedoms are restrained, right? Remember that. So there you are. Liberty doesn't mean the will, the freedom to do anything you will, or perhaps what we call the freedom of the wild ass. Those liberties are accompanied by serious duties. I cannot think of a liberty or a right that is not accompanied by a duty, my dear students. But we don't talk too much about the duties because duties are not justiciable. So we don't talk about it. We assume that because it is not justiciable in both our constitutions, we actually don't pay serious heed to it, although, of course, the Supreme Court in many judgments, right, have said that duties are probably can be elevated to for fundamental rights. So there you are, right? So there you are. We've got to understand that the whole ethos regarding fundamental rights and duties and obligations and rights and liberties it works well within a framework that has respect for the fundamental rights of others. They're not the only one who is exercising your fundamental right. There are millions and there are 10 billion, right? Others, certainly in India, 1.35 billion who are also exercising their fundamental rights, and that you have to be sensitive to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering those questions with great and informative examples. Now I would call upon our academic coordinator, ma'am, Monica Kharula, ma'am, for the session of vote of thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Usha.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure listening to you, and you have very well summed up the whole pandemic situation where individuals have to balance their rights along with duty. The pandemic has changed the way that we look at the world. We were more focused on our rights and how we are as a state have not only rights within the states, but even in the UN, how each of us were there competing with each other. But this pandemic has shown that if human survival has to be there, then we must work with each other together for survival and enhancing whatever we have today. So the duty of the state also, the state was created and it was there to protect us. But for that protection, if it is bound to restrict certain liberty, it is duty bound to do that, because the first duty lies in protecting the rights of citizens for survival, the right itself. So you have very well emphatically stressed upon how enjoyment of liberty cannot be done at the cost of the duties that we serve. And probably that is why under international law, the third generation rights, the community rights and the duties that we have to the community are being increasingly felt, and it is being encouraged that communities talk about it, try to protect the community's rights also. And the community today is the world. As you rightly said, these superficial distinction and differences that we have in terms of religion, language, ethnicity, and in fact, even the borders have become immaterial today. So therefore, it is not only the rights of the individuals that have to be protected, but it is the duty of all individuals to humanity. And that duty today is foremost, and the pandemic has shown that we better, stick to our duties also in order to survive. So the human being as a community owe it to all. Sir, it's been a pleasure listening to you. And
Thank you.
the national perspective, you have very nicely brought about the economic, social, and cultural rights that are there in our Bill of Human Rights, how it is important for the small, especially for the small states, to see that we are able to achieve survival. And if washing of hands today is the simplest thing, if we can use it to protect ourselves, thank God it is only at the cost of this much. So it is our duty to protect ourselves and to see that we do not, put others also at risk. So today, our Trojans has, evolved, and today we are at a stage where we have to work together. And human rights is all about protecting rights of every individual anywhere in the world. Sir, thank you once again. Our students and all participants of this webinar have immensely benefited from your views and opinions. We look forward to you sometimes visiting this beautiful city of Dehradun and coming to ICFI University, Dehradun.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we are very much grateful to you for your juristic discourse. on right to liberty and duty to community during this COVID-19 pandemic. It was wonderful,
Yes.
sir. It was very informative, and we have learned a lot. And I now, from the core of my heart, thank you, sir, and wish
Oh,
that we will
such a pleasure.
have your association with us, and next time again we will be blessed by your juristic thoughts.
Thank you,
sir. Thank you very
Professor.
much, sir.
Thank you. All the way.
Thank you very
Namaskar.
much, sir. Very
Namaskar.
kind of you, sir,
Thank you.
for accepting our invitation. Thank you,
Thank
sir.